good morning, again, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you're joining us from. And thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar on conflict-sensitive conservation in a changing climate. My name is Onyinye Oguntoye, and I lead communications for the Climate Adaptation and Protected Areas Initiative at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, or you call it IISD. You'll learn all about the initiative as the webinar progresses. Before we get started, I just wanted to share a few housekeeping points so we can keep this in mind. Today's session will last about an hour, and you will have time to ask questions at the very end. So keep all your questions in the chat and we'll attend to all of them as the webinar progresses. Secondly, feel free to say hello, introduce yourself in the chat by typing your name, your organization, and where you're joining us from. The next thing I wanted to flag is that we'll be recording today's webinar and we'll be sharing that on the IISD website along with other resources like the presentation that will be used for this event. So keep an eye out for that in your inbox after this. And then lastly, if you have any questions, like I said earlier, or you need technical support, please drop it in the chat and I or my colleagues will try to attend to that as soon as possible. Now, to get us started today, we have an exciting panel of speakers to share their expertise on climate change adaptation and conflict-sensitive conservation in a changing climate. Today, we'll be hearing from Alec Crawford, who is the Director of Nature for Resilience at IISD. And Alec will set the foundation and just explain what conflict-sensitive conservation means and why it actually matters. Then we'll move on to Nalucha Nganga, who is the country director for WWF Zambia, and she will focus on the lived realities of people with human-wildlife conflicts in Zambia and examples of how her team has been implementing conflict-sensitive conservation. And last but not the least, we'll move on to Hesta Groenewald, who is a senior associate on conflict sensitivity at PeaceNexus Foundation. Hesta will take us through some practical tips for integrating conflict sensitivity in our day-to-day work, both in organizational culture, but also into the design and implementation of conservation activities. So that's our lineup of speakers. It promises to be exciting. And now I'll keep quiet and pass it on to Alec. So Alec, without further ado, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thanks very much, Anya, and welcome everyone to this webinar. Thank you so much for joining us today. So as Anya mentioned, my name is Alec Crawford. I'm the Director of Nature for Resilience at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, which is a Canadian policy research think tank. I'm calling in today from Toronto, Canada, quite cold Toronto, Canada. It's about -10 this morning here. So I see in the chat that many of you are calling in from much warmer climes. So I'm jealous of you all. But without further ado, we'll get into the content of the webinar. So next slide, please. This webinar is coming to you from an initiative called the CAPA Initiative, or the Climate Adaptation and Protected Areas Initiative, which is a project that IISD is working on with partners at WWF as well as the Wildlife Conservation Society, which seeks to promote natural solutions to strengthening climate resilience and protecting biodiversity. And essentially, the question that the project is trying to answer is, how can you use protected areas as a means of increasing the resilience both of the ecosystems and of the communities that surround those ecosystems to climate change? So we're working with conservation partners, local communities, traditionally marginalized groups, particularly women's groups, and the national and local authorities to actually design and implement nature-based solutions to climate adaptation within protected areas and critical landscapes. And then also trying to better integrate climate adaptation decision-making into the management of these spaces. The project is working in 4 different landscapes. So we're working in Fiji, we're working in Belize with WCS, and then we're also working in 2 landscapes in Africa, the Greater Virunga landscape, primarily in Uganda, and then also the Kavango-Zambezi landscape, or the Kaza landscape, which you'll hear a bit more about throughout the event. One of the things that we came up against during the implementation of the project was a clear recognition of the fact that climate change was not only changing livelihoods and communities and ecosystems across the landscapes that we were working in, but it was proving to be an increasingly important contributing factor to conflict. So we approached the design and implementation of our conservation interventions and our nature-based solutions in as conflict-sensitive a way as possible, considering the, again, conflict implications of that work, to try to ensure that at the very least these interventions did no harm, but on a more positive side were potentially platforms for peace building. Next slide, please. So how are conservation and conflict connected? This may not be new to many of you on the call, but just to take a step back, conservation interventions, conservation management is essentially, to my mind, a form of conflict management because it entails protecting, managing, restoring ecosystems and landscapes, but making decisions around scarce natural resources. And if you're making decisions around scarce natural resources, who can access them, who can control them, who can use them, you will inevitably be coming up against competing interests. And these decisions can cause or exacerbate tensions or grievances or other forms of local conflict if they're not made in a conflict-sensitive way. These links between natural resources and conflict are especially high and evident in contexts where poverty, inequality, dependence on natural resources are particularly high or defining characteristics of that context. Next slide, please. So how can conservation lead to conflict? There's a few ways in which we've seen this can happen, but one of the ways that we've come across is the unequitable distribution of benefits. So if a conservation program, for example, distributes benefits to certain communities, certain individuals over others, those inequalities can lead to tensions or grievances, whether they're real or whether they're just perceived at the local level. So that distribution of benefits is crucial. Next slide, please. Another way is, of course, the restriction of access to livelihood resources. So the protection and restoration of biodiversity, ecosystems, their services might actually reduce community access to critical livelihood resources that they depend on, whether it's forest products, non-timber forest products, land, pasture. Restricting access to those resources can be a source of tension between local communities and park authorities, for example. Next slide, please. Another way is the introduction of economic burdens or risks. So if you as a conservation professional or conservation practitioner are implementing actions that protect or augment wildlife populations, as an example, in a critical ecosystem, that can lead to new economic burdens or increased economic burdens or personal risks for nearby communities. And as you can see in the illustration here, one of the main ways that that manifests is through human-wildlife conflict. Next slide, please. So what forms might these conflicts take? They could take many forms, I would argue. One of them is, of course, human-wildlife conflicts. So the conflicts between wildlife populations and the communities that surround protected areas. There can also be institutional conflicts, so tensions that arise between institutions such as, the protected areas authorities, other parts of government, other institutions at the local, national, or regional level. With differing ideas or differing strategies or ideas, visions for conservation. Transboundary conflicts can obviously arise if a protected area or a critical landscape goes across an international frontier. Countries may, of course, have differing capacities, differing visions for conservation, and conflicts and tensions can arise around those. As I mentioned, resource access conflicts are fairly common at the local level, I think, in and around a lot of protected areas. Again, that idea of benefit distribution conflicts and the perceived or real inequality when it comes to the distribution of benefits from conservation. And then, of course, park people conflicts are not new to many of you. So those conflicts between the local population and the Parks Authority over conservation decision-making and natural resource management decision-making. Next slide, please. So how can these conflicts impact conservation? This can happen in a number of direct ways, of course. You can see the destruction of biodiversity, ecosystems and their services, the overexploitation of resources, threats to personnel on the park side, illegal resource trafficking. This is not a complete list of the ways in which conflict can affect conservation outcomes. There's also indirect impacts that can happen. So, of course, the presence of conflict can lead to lost funding for conservation within a critical landscape. It can lead to the deprioritization of conservation activities as other, perhaps humanitarian or other development priorities come to the forefront. Of course, conflict weakens governance oftentimes for natural resource management and conservation at the local level. And then, of course, it can also shorten your planning horizon when it comes to making conservation decision making. Of course, at the local level, oftentimes these conflicts can also, tragically lead to injury and, in the worst times, the loss of life. And those are, of course, the conflict impacts that want to be avoided to the greatest extent. Next slide, please. So, what is conflict-sensitive conservation? This might be a new term or a new approach to some of you on the call. Others may be quite familiar with it, but it's effectively an approach to conservation design and implementation that considers the causes, the actors, the dynamics, and the impacts of conflict to minimize those risks and potentially enhance peace-building opportunities. So how are you using a comprehensive understanding of the context in which you're doing your conservation interventions to design and implement them in a way that is sensitive to conflict dynamics? So conflict-sensitive conservation, if done right, can help ensure that at the very least, again, there's this do no harm principle when it comes to conservation. At the very least, conservation interventions do not exacerbate existing risks or create new tensions, but rather, in the best possible case scenario, they lead to dialogue, trust building, cooperation between different stakeholder groups around conservation outcomes. Next slide, please. So how do you do this in a changing climate? What does climate change mean for conflict-sensitive conservation? Again, this is something that really came up early in the Kappa project that we're all working on. And effectively what we're seeing, I think, at the landscape level, at the ecosystem level, is that climate change is having an increasing effect, and it's increasingly a central driver of biodiversity loss and ecosystem degradation. In the Kaza landscape, which Nalucha will speak to in particular, this has been particularly severe given a multi-year drought that they're experiencing there. So climate change is increasingly a driver of biodiversity loss. At the same time, that ecosystem degradation is also contributing to greenhouse gas emissions. It's undermining the ability of communities and ecosystems to adapt to climate change. So what we're seeing is kind of a vicious cycle between these two global crises, global environmental crises of biodiversity loss and climate change. But we're also seeing that protected areas can be a critical tool in the toolbox when it comes to the fight against both of these crises. So how can we use protected areas both as a means of addressing the climate crisis, both from a mitigation and adaptation standpoint, but also, of course, using them to reverse biodiversity loss and ecosystem degradation? So within the conservation space, again, these mutually reinforcing crises are exacerbating the drivers of conservation-related conflicts that we're seeing quite a bit. Resource scarcity and competition, poverty and inequality, food insecurity, loss of livelihoods, those drivers of conflict that we've seen for many, many decades that are associated with conservation don't seem to be getting better within a changing climate. So the changing climate is really kind of exacerbating those drivers of conservation-related conflicts. But we think, and we would argue, and maybe you'll agree with us, that climate-resilient, conflict-sensitive conservation through interventions that include ecosystem-based adaptation, nature-based solutions for adaptation, they can help try to break this vicious cycle, essentially. So if you're designing your conservation interventions in a way that are both climate-resilient and conflict-sensitive, you can start to get to the heart of these drivers of tension, drivers of grievance, drivers of conflict, and hopefully get to a place where, again, these conservation interventions are helping to address both of these crises. Next slide, please. So again, one of the things that we want to use this webinar to do and to have a discussion around is how conservation can be used as a tool for both climate resilience and peace. So again, through conflict-sensitive, climate-resilient conservation, can you achieve your local conservation goals? Protection, restoration, sustainable management of biodiversity and natural resources. But can you also at the same time strengthen community and ecosystem resilience to climate change by strengthening these landscapes, these critical ecosystems, but then also address the underlying drivers of both climate vulnerability and conflict? So addressing things like poverty, inequality, uh, resource degradation, livelihood insecurity, food insecurity. Can you address those underlying drivers of both climate vulnerability and conflict to a more positive end? I'll leave it there so that we can get into kind of a case study of how the Kappa initiative has worked on this. But I'll pass it back to Anya to pass the floor over to Nalucha. Anya, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Alec. That was such a nice way to set the stage for the conversation we're having today. I'll now pass it on to Nalucha, who will talk about what's going on in Zambia and what we've been doing so far. So, Nalucha, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Onia. Thank you, Alex, for that elaborate discussion and presentation on conflict-sensitive. On our part as WWF, we have been working in the Kaza or the Kavango Zambezi landscape, implementing nature-based solution. This landscape is arguably one of the largest TFCs and covers about 5 countries. And in terms of the work that we are doing, the specific sites on the Zambian side of the Kaza has been the Siomangwezi National Park in the western province of Zambia, and also the Mosotunya National Park in the southern province of Zambia. We are also doing work around the lower west Zambezi, which is Mlowezi, Sichiflo, as well as Mufunta game management areas, and also the Tochololo Wangwe ecosystem, as well as Chizerere landscape in Zimbabwe. On the Zambezi region of the Namibian side is what also our colleagues, WWF Namibian partners, are covering. And then we are working on the Kwandu River in the Wanga-Diena National Park in Angola. And the work that we are doing is mainly modeling and working with local communities in terms of upscaling nature-based solutions. Some of the work is around adaptation in terms of interventions, which are related to promoting the restoration of forest cover, and also strengthening indigenous forest systems and stabilizing headwater, riverine, and functions on natural lagoons, wetlands to enhance ecosystem integrity and biodiversity. Part of the work that we have done is being able to distill, for instance, lagoons in the Mosotunya National Parks in areas where we have, in parts where we have seen droughts. Then in terms of land use and cover change analysis, as well as assessment of existing protected areas. We have also been working to identify and initiating formal protection and expansion of protected areas, as well as establishing native tree nurseries, working mainly with local communities, more especially CFMGs, as well as women and youth groups across the Kaza landscape, but also restocking community game ranches with national wildlife to restore ecological balance. And also we've initiated the establishment of community forest groups as gazetted, some of them which have even been gazetted by the forestry department on the Zambian side. Then also working to strengthen climate smart agriculture around protected areas. We are looking at climate smart agriculture as a way of responding to the drought that the Southern African part faced, most of the region where we are working in, but also as a response to the human-wildlife conflict, more especially the conflict between elephants and humans around resources such as water and food. So in terms of climate smart agriculture, we have been supporting what we call cluster farms across the region, where communities are put to undertake farming in protected small portions of land, which are fenced off and protected from elephants' encroachment. Further, we are protecting the Kavango Zambezi landscape natural river systems and floodplains from increasing temperatures and droughts. We can move to the next slide. Then we undertook a comprehensive risks assessment in the year 2023, which examined climate, biodiversity, gender, as well as conflict risks. The foundation assessments focused mainly on issues to do with drought, heat waves, decreased rainfall, as well as declining tree cover and extreme weather events. We can move to the next. slide. So in terms of some of the findings that we saw with the focus on drought was that the Kasa is home to more elephants than any other landscape in the world. And the catastrophic multi-year drought, which exacerbated water scarcity in already a dry landscape, which usually receives very less rainfall compared to other parts of the region. Then severe water constraints inside the Kasa parks increasingly pushed animals, including elephants, into towns and settlements in search of water. As a result, we have seen an increase in human-wildlife conflict across the region. And for instance, in the Mosotunya National Park, the sites where we find the magnificent Victoria Falls lays adjacent to the town of Livingstone in the Zambian side with a population of around 178,000 people, which is a significant site for conflict. We have seen a lot of elephants that are coming, moving to this area in search of water and in search of food. As part of a response to that, we can move to the next slide. Part of the work that we have done in that area, if you look at this as part of the area, it's very dry and with very limited food for wildlife, but also water for both human and wildlife. So part of the work that we've been doing is reforestry such areas as the one you can see. We can move to the next slide. And also desilting some of the natural lagoons in the park. Desilting, that is one of the natural lagoons which we desilted, such that when the rain season comes, they are able to hold water for much longer period, and then the animals won't have to venture out into communities in search for water. Like right now, it's a rainy season in this part of the world. We are seeing quite a bit of rainfall activities, but in the southern part where you find the Mosotunya, as well as the other parks, will receive minimal rainfall compared to other parts of the country and the region, and that itself exacerbates conflicts between wildlife and animals. So in responding to that, we have been working both in Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Angola and Namibia in terms of desilting natural lagoons, so that then we are able to hold water for much longer period. Next slide. So what I would say is that all in all, we have partnered with local communities in terms of establishing nurseries. As you can see, working closely with women across the Kasa landscape who we are supporting with being able to grow nurseries of indigenous trees. And then we are able to get them back to reforest some of the areas which have been affected, more especially with the drought. It exacerbated charcoal burning as well as cutting down of trees for firewood across the region. And as a response to that, we have been able to work with local communities to be able to reforest some of the affected areas, but also being able to put in place check dams in some of the areas. So what happens is that we can move to the next slide. When the rain season, as currently we have, it's able to slow down the flow of water. And when that happens, we are able to see that it reduces the conflict between wildlife and animal, and we're able to also see some of the wildlife coming back. And also in terms of addressing the conflict between wildlife and human beings, part of the things we have done is to capacitate the Department of National Parks, working with the government to come up with campaigns with local communities where they're able to be sensitized, as well as information is given in terms of how they deal with, for instance, the rising number of elephants. There, the picture you can see there is in Livingstone, where we were launching a campaign on human-wildlife conflict in view of the increased population around elephants in that town, and then being able to give information to communities in terms of how they're able to deal with the elephants. As opposed to throwing stones, they're able to call on the department to come and remove the elephants for their own safety, as well as for the safety of the animals back into the park, as well as in protected areas. Next slide. I think that's where my presentation ends.
Thank you so much, Nalucha, for that really interesting case study, and just sharing more what's going on in Zambia and what you've been doing so far. I will turn it over now to Hesta, who will talk through some practical tips on how we actually just integrate this in organizations as well. So Hesta, go on. It's yours now.
Thanks, Onye. And very nice to be with all of you today and to be discussing all these really interesting topics. And literally, it's my day job. It is my entire day job to do this integration work. So I'm going to try to just pick out a few points, but in the hope that it sparks some thoughts and some inspiration for people, and we can have a bit more of a discussion in the Q&A section. So you can go to the first slide, please. I want to start from here because this year, one of the biggest things that we've done is we've really built together with IISD and other partners. We've put together the knowledge that we've gained on conflict sensitive approaches, both in the aid sector and in the conservation and environment sector, to launch and develop a course on conflict sensitive conservation. And I'll say a bit more about that at the end. But this visual is really an explanation of what we've learned over many years of practice, that when you're trying to adapt a conflict sensitive approach, you quite often work at these two levels. The one is around project level and the program level. That's where the human wildlife conflict happens. That's where you really see the conflicts of interest happening. So that's where, as we say in our organization, we always say this is where it hurts for people. This is where the topic first comes up. And so there's a lot of things that can be done already at the project level, as Alex was also hinting and as Nalucha was explaining, to bring in that conflict sensitivity lens. And then around it, there's also the organizational level, the enabling conditions that help us to work in this way at the project level. And I just want to signpost a few areas there that I'm going to come back to. The one, what we try to do in visualization of this course is to say, well, what are the entry points? When we're trying to think about applying a conflict sensitive approach to our nature conservation work, then where are the points where we can quite easily start to put some practices in place to bring that lens across? So the first one, you'll see the top left circle is around bringing it into our analysis and assessment. The second one is about stakeholder engagement. How do we engage with the people we engage with? And the third one is around if we want to go beyond just avoiding the doing harm, but we actually want to make a positive contribution, how would we do that? And in the middle, you'll see there's a part of the infographic that has the sort of project cycle reference, because a lot of us have to work with that project cycle design element. So next slide, please. Then we can touch on each of them. So on the project cycle side, when we adopt a conflict sensitive approach, we're really looking at identifying and prioritizing and analyzing the conflicts that are already present in the landscapes and the areas where we work, assessing how might what we do be impacting on those conflict dynamics, so alongside the environment and climate and nature conservation questions that we'll be analyzing, redesigning our activities so we really react to that analysis and make sure that we can avoid doing harm and at best we can make a positive contribution, and then really implementing, monitoring, adapting. It's a very live process to check what impacts are we having and how do we adjust how we work. Next slide, please. So I mentioned those three entry point areas. The first one is really around this conflict and conflict analysis, context analysis. And you may be saying, well, we're already doing 12 different types of analysis when we come into a new landscape. So what does this add? And really what this adds is we're just looking at what are the conflicts that are present, social-political conflicts that may be directly related to the conservation work that we do, or it may be broader than that, but it impacts on our work. So what are the conflicts about and who's involved in it? And then that question about what does that mean for my work? How do I need to adjust the project activities that I do or the people I work with in order to not have a negative impact and ideally have a positive contribution to social cohesion? Next slide, please. The second entry point is really about the stakeholder engagement. And I think it's quite accepted practice now that good stakeholder engagement is so important for efficient conservation work and climate adaptation work as well. And when you bring that conflict sensitivity lens, you're really looking quite deeply at who should be engaged and who's excluded. So if we're taking a rights-based lens, of course, that means that certain groups have particular rights to be included. And then add to that, who else should we be speaking to, who may feel excluded, and then start blocking the work that we're doing because there's a dynamic that we were not aware of. And then how do we engage them? How do we work with them? How do we communicate? How do we manage expectations? So that's a big element of doing conflict-sensitive stakeholder engagement. And I would just also note there that our own positioning is super important. We are sometimes impartial and sometimes we are not, because we are there to specific conservation aims. And being aware of that can really help us to be sensitive in how we manage these relationships on the ground. Next slide, please. So then if we think about that sort of positive impact side, managing conflicts, facilitating or supporting positive dialogues and helping to contribute to social cohesion, there are certain things that we can do to really make that positive contribution. Sometimes just by working on the better governance of a natural resource, we're already addressing a cause of conflict. And other times it may be a very deliberate effort to say, well, actually, if the relationship between the indigenous people and local community in this area was better with the park authorities, it would reduce the conflict and it would help our conservation aims. Can we really contribute to that and sort of build trust and alliances between some of these groups in a positive way? So just a guiding question on that. Next slide, please. To make this a bit real, this is an actual example, but I'm not naming names because we work with quite a lot of different organizations who are taking this approach into their own work. And this particular example is set in the Eastern DRC. And what this organization did is they had already a process that they wanted to implement around their safeguards framework. And what they did is they did conflict analysis alongside their safeguards assessments and then made sure that that was a very inclusive analysis. So they talked to different farmer communities, fishers communities. They made sure that the focus group and research methods were gender specific, that women had their own space to speak, and therefore they were able to get a lot of good information about different perspectives. Then moving from that, they went to design their grievance response mechanism. But instead of only focusing, they did do the bit where it focuses on their own impacts and where people might have grievances against the projects that they were leading. But they also built in a component of if there are any other conflicts that come up, what capacities and what structures were already present on the ground that could help to pick up some of these other conflicts and resolve them. And so they'd identified quite a few local civil society organizations, but also traditional peace committees and other community-based structures that were already in a good position. And so they did a bit of work around supporting them, connecting them with each other and connecting them with their own team so that they're better able to manage some of the other conflicts that were arising. And they also identified that underdevelopment and lack of livelihood opportunities was a major conflict cause. So they tried to also build in this idea of mutual solidarity schemes as part of the conservation project that they did to start addressing that. So it just gives a little snapshot of the types of things that people have done and are doing. Next slide, please. So I said at the beginning, there's these two levels. The one is the second level beyond the projects is the organizational level. If we're trying to be adaptive, if we're trying to monitor the context, that means that we need to be building certain questions into our monitoring or evaluation frameworks. It means that we need to have flexibility in our budgets. We may need to be able to work for a longer inception period to do more consultations with stakeholders. So what are these enabling conditions around the projects that can really help us to work in this conflict-sensitive way? Next slide, please. I'm not going to talk through that because there's a lot of text, but just to show that this is a sort of organizational framework that we often use, because when you're trying to embed this conflict-sensitive approach and you want to consider the organizational dimensions, there are all these different elements happening. And so as I was just mentioning around, for instance, budgeting or having staff with the right skills or having leadership support, those would all fit in different parts of this triangle. It could be a structure, it could be the people skills, and there could also be an element around external enablers. What are our peers doing? Or do we have a donor who's actually asking us to mainstream conflict sensitivity in our project? And that can really help us to create the internal conversation and put some resources and some energy behind that whole agenda. And then I think the last slide, I just wanted to show the postcard of the course, and all those logos at the bottom is the steering committee of the different organizations we worked with, which of course includes IISD and WWF. So we have two of our collaborators on this call. And the QR code, normally, if you can read it, will take you straight to the page. This is the course is now on the IUCN Academy's website. We've made it available for free, and it's fully online. So you can do it in your own time. There are exercises you can download in PDF format. and you can use the course as you see fit in your own organizations. So I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to come back to some questions and further discussion. Thanks, Oni.
Thank you very much, Hesta. That was really interesting to hear. And thanks all our panelists for the conversation so far. We already have questions trickling in. So maybe I would start with the first question and then we'll walk through. We currently have 4 questions now. So the first question here says, thank you for the great presentation. Could you highlight the potential of conflict-sensitive conservation around also as a climate mitigation strategy within NDCs, any national case study that you have that shows good practices? So maybe I will turn that to Alec and Hesta, and then the next question I have is for Nalucha.
Yeah, I can jump in here. So thanks very much for that question. I haven't seen within an NDC an explicit call for conflict-sensitive conservation myself. That doesn't mean that it's not in there, but I think that there is a need to bring that lens into a lot of the conservation-related mitigation strategies that would be included in NDC. So if, for example, a government is, you know, promoting reduced deforestation, reforestation, afforestation programs as a means of trying to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, I think that they do have to design and implement those interventions in a way that considers, you know, local perspectives and local livelihoods, and makes the appropriate considerations for those local livelihoods in the design and implementation of those strategies, because it may be that at the local level, there's a heavy reliance on things like, you know, timber for construction, you know, lands that will be reforested under an NDC, used as pasture lands, for example. You're again making decisions on access to, control of, use of natural resources and land for your overall mitigation strategy. But when you do that, you're coming up against competing perspectives and competing interests when it comes to those natural resources. And as a result, I think integrating conflict sensitivity into those decisions is just good practice, because in, again, having a comprehensive understanding of that context, but then also working with local communities, working with local authorities, working with all stakeholder groups on how those programs are designed and implemented so that you can achieve your mitigation objectives, but also do so without compromising, again, local livelihoods and local natural resource management practices, is crucial to ensure that you're not kind of barreling full steam ahead on a mitigation strategy that then gets you into a lot of trouble at the local level because of those decisions on natural resources. But again, I unfortunately don't have like a case study that I could point to within an NDC, but just to underscore the fact that I would find it just good practice to bring that conflict sensitivity lens into it. So at the very least, you ensure that your NDC is doing no harm.
Thanks, Alec. Okay, so I'll go to the next question now. The next question is directed towards Nalucha. There are 3 questions in one, actually. So the first one says, the farmers around the protected areas from which you're strengthening conflict-sensitive adaptation, what are the mechanisms you are using to prevent wildlife from encroaching the farms? So what method are you using to prevent wildlife from encroaching farms in PAs? The second one is, what types of trees are you using to reforest those dry areas? And then the third question is, do other local community groups participate on the establishment of community gardens and elephant fences? Because the pictures shown are of only women. And if it's only women, why not other community groups?
Thank you for those questions. Starting with the first one, what are we using to prevent the wildlife in terms of the conflict with the gardens that they're establishing? So we are fencing, we are putting them in what we call cluster farms, which are then fenced with an elephant restraining wire around it so that it's able to restrain the elephants from encroaching the crops. Then part of the things that we also undertake is training communities into the use of chili, as well as making chili bombers and those so that, and also growing chili themselves, so that it's the interventions are more localized other than being highly dependent on ourselves as WWF. Then in terms of the trees that they are growing, it's mainly indigenous trees. So they do go back and pick seeds in those forests. So we don't want to introduce exotic trees or trees which are not indigenous to those forests, so that we don't distort the ecosystem. So rather they pick the seeds themselves, mainly the women, including the men, and then it's from there that they're able to generate their nurseries from. And yes, the picture shows women, but we also do have men and we do have youth. So we do have cooperatives. Some of them are working as a cooperative in the areas. Some of them are working as youth cooperatives. Some of them are women cooperatives. Some of them are mixed, even though the picture we showed was that of women, but it's really, the approach takes almost everyone in the community. It's not really, it doesn't choose to say it's just purely women, but we're just trying to encourage more women and youth, more especially youth, when it comes to restoration activities. Over.
Thank you very much, Nalucha. So I'll go to the next question now. This is from Sophia Kurtz, and she says that in the context of armed or violent conflicts due to conservation responses or interacting in conservation spaces, how do you recommend to engage with those actors? And how do you recommend to engage with those actors who are key to better understand conflict-sensitive conservation assessments or conflict analysis? And the person says they meant non-state armed actors. So maybe I'll pass this one to Hesta.
Easy question to answer. No, thank you, Onyi. And thanks, Sophia, for the question. I think that's a really hot topic. And I think in our experience, and it would be nice to hear also from others, but in our experience with our partners, there are different organizational positions on whether conservation organizations are able to engage with armed non-state actors. But quite often they don't have a choice and they have to engage with armed non-state actors. And it's the same dilemma that peace-building organizations face, in the sense that these groups are in the territories where you work, and therefore you do have to engage with them. And at the same time, you have to do it very carefully, because you might be seen as talking to a prescribed group or siding with a particular part of the conflict. So it is something that really requires very careful planning, and that requires very clear articulation of the principles of the organization. Why are you talking to this group? What is the purpose of it? And who else are you talking to? And being very transparent about that, and in as much as that works for the particular context. So there's no cookie cutter response to that question. It is very context specific and something to be engaged with very, very carefully. I don't know, Alec, if you had any examples of anything like that. I know a lot of countries are doing this, but they're all doing it slightly differently.
Yeah, no, I don't. I mean, I have, it's exactly as you say. I think it's a case by case, organization by organization approach. I've had, experience in situations such as in Eastern DRC is a good example where, armed groups control a national park wherein you would find mountain gorillas. Let's say, as this isn't a fake example. This is a very real example. And that armed group has cut off access for conservation organizations whose entire mandate is the protection of these mountain gorillas. And it really does lead to some very difficult questions for conservation organizations on whether you have to engage with the group to gain access to the mountain gorillas, thereby like continuing to justify your presence in the landscape. Or if, again, at an organizational level, you have a mandate not to do that, how, as a conservation organization, can you again continue to justify your presence in a landscape if you can't access the landscape? And oftentimes, I think you see conservation organizations shifting into integrated conservation and development plan activities with local communities, while they wait for the opportunity or the window to get back to that particular species of concern or landscape of concern or ecosystem of concern. But it's a very, very hard moral question for organizations to answer, I think, particularly when these armed non-state groups are causing such, chaos and suffering at the local level. To be seen as working with them can fray that relationship that maybe you have with local communities as well. So there's not an easy answer to that question, unfortunately, Sophia. It's a really important one, and one that I know a lot of conservation organizations and practitioners lose a lot of sleep about, because if their mandate is the protection of species, it's the protection of ecosystems. If that becomes difficult because of these stakeholder groups, then yeah, it's really existential for some organizations at the local level. So very, very, very difficult.
Okay, well, thanks. So we still have lots of questions coming through. The next question, maybe I'll direct to Nalucha. So this says political will is often tied to short-term gains, while conservation requires long-term commitments. How can we build a powerful domestic constituency for conservation where voters and politicians cannot ignore, especially when immediate economic pressures are so severe? And Nalucha, maybe you can speak to this from the point of view of having done this in Zambia for a while, how you've been able to do this work, transcending different political wills and oppositions, for lack of a better word.
Thank you. Yes, for us to work around issues of conservation, issues of sustainability, yes, it's everyone's business, and it requires to bring on board all the players. And part of the work that we have done, as opposed to just being focused on the communities, we have lobbied the traditional leadership in those areas and have brought them on board. So you find, for instance, even when we are building things like check dams, you find that when we were doing that in Mosotunya in Livingston, you found that one of our biggest supporters was Chief Mukuni himself, and he was also taking part in those activities. And that is by demonstrating leadership and being at the center and being able to. We've also seen that with Chieftainess Mwezu and various others, as well as Chief Lukama in Sioma and other areas where we have been doing this work, where the chiefs have been brought on board and they have been very key and instrumental in our work. But also in terms of building the leadership and the political power, we have also involved the offices of the members of parliament, as well as the elected local government representatives, that is the councillors on the ground, as leaders as well as civic leaders. So they have also come on board and being able to support and provide the necessary support that is needed to undertake this work in the communities. For instance, when you are talking about human-wildlife conflict in Zambia, you do have resources that are able to unlock some of the infrastructure that is needed to address human-wildlife conflict. For instance, in areas that are very prone to or have higher rates of human-wildlife conflict, you find that we have the constituency development funds, but most of the time those funds, when applications are being made, they're more tailored towards things to do with social services such as health, schools, and roads, as opposed to looking at it to say we can also apply and get to build a house, for instance, for a Wadna who will be able to be within the community and be able to support the human-wildlife conflict as it occurs, or be able to respond on time. So part of the things we have done is also to be able to influence the guidelines for the Constituency Development Fund, so that they're broadened not just beyond the social aspects, but also to look at the environmental as well as conservation aspects. So yes, we do agree with the need to bring on board leadership from all angles, and most importantly is to get their buy-in into the work that we are doing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nalucha. The next question is slightly tied to this, but doesn't have to be you, Nalucha, answering. This one is talking about inclusion of stakeholders, but at the point of the conflict analysis being done and the design of the strategy. So this could be mitigation or adaptation. Where in the project cycle do you include stakeholders, and how do you handle the power dynamic between those actors that will likely have opposite interests and internal conflicts. I would argue that a conservation organization will always be part of local conflicts? That's an interesting question. So maybe, Alec, I can turn it to you first because I know you developed a guidance on a process that you can think through when integrating conflict sensitivity and projects.
Sure. No, thanks so much for the question, Casper. And I would agree with you. And I think I mentioned that in my presentation that oftentimes conservationists are conflict managers, or they're involved in conflict dynamics because again they're making decisions oftentimes in contexts of poverty and inequality and natural resource dependence around who can access, use, and control natural resources. So I think that the question of stakeholder engagement, stakeholder inclusion is an incredibly important one. I think that Nalucha would echo this, but the conservation partners that we've worked with in the past would also say that engagement has to happen very much early in the process. So you have to have that understanding of climate risk, of conflict risk, of biodiversity risk early in the process of designing conservation interventions, and getting a full understanding, a comprehensive understanding of that risk relies on those local perspectives, and it relies on that local lived experience of the communities that are in and around these critical landscapes and these protected areas. So it's very hard, I think, for a conservation organization to project their understanding of risk onto a local community without having those conversations. And as such, I think they have to be involved in the early stages. One of the key tools I think that you can use in a conflict analysis, again, during the early design stage of a conservation intervention, is to do a stakeholder mapping exercise whereby you work with stakeholder groups to understand not only who the key players are in an area, in a conflict situation, but also their relationship to each other. So are there alliances between particular stakeholder groups? Are there open conflicts between particular stakeholder groups? Are there blocked communications? Are there open communications? Where do you situate yourself as a conservation organization within those conflict dynamics within that map? That understanding is crucial because it gives you potential entry points as well to those groups that you can work with and that you can cooperate with to open up dialogue with other groups that you might not have contact with, but effectively to kind of come up with these constructive dialogues very early in the process and design conservation interventions that reflect the needs of the local community. Because, and I think that this relates to some of the other questions that are coming through about competing priorities around natural resource use, particularly in kind of extreme contexts. You have to ensure that the local community is on board with your conservation intervention and that they are seeing benefit from that intervention. They understand why you're doing it, or else the intervention isn't going to succeed. Maybe if we have a little bit of time, so I'll go into another anecdotal example from the Kappa initiative just to kind of underscore how we're seeing this happen in these landscapes. So as I mentioned, we're working in the Virunga landscape, particularly in Uganda. And there's a park in Uganda called Queen Elizabeth National Park, which is a savanna ecosystem. Some of you may have been there in the west of the country. It's a beautiful landscape, but what we've seen, or what they have seen, Uganda Wildlife Authority and other partners like WWF, is that climate change has essentially supercharged invasive species. So species within the park ecosystem that are more resilient to temperature change and drought conditions are starting to take over the savanna ecosystem. And one of them in particular is this very thorny bush called sickle bush, which is essentially like choking out the park and the landscape for mammals, whether it's ungulates, antelope, or the predators that rely on them. Even elephants are having a hard time moving around this landscape now because this invasive species has just taken off because of climate change. What this is doing is it's effectively shifting animals into local communities. So they're being pushed outside of the park in search of fodder, in search of prey, in search of water sources, because the savanna ecosystem has been kind of overrun by invasive species, turbocharged by climate change. As a result of this, we've been working through WWF and local civil society organizations with the local communities to design interventions for those human wildlife conflicts that are effectively exploding at the local level. So again, similar to what we're doing in Zambia that Nalucha explained, working with them on elephant fences, on water points within the park, on invasive species removal, to try to ensure that we're co-designing these interventions with the local community, that they understand why the design is in response to conflict and in response to trying to address those conflicts to very much assure that their livelihoods are secured, that their food security is secured, that their water security is secured, and that they can kind of live in peace with the protected area and also understand the benefit that the protected area provides them through the ecosystem services that a good ecosystem provides to a local community. But again, it's working with the community on the design of those interventions so that they meet their livelihood needs, but also start to address these human wildlife conflicts that are just, accelerating because of climate change at the local level. I don't know if Hesta, you want to add anything on stakeholder engagement.
If Orny will allow me, I'll just add a few sentences. I know we're very short on time, but I just wanted to circle back a little bit to some of the things that Alec was saying there about the stakeholder engagement, because I think that's where also the ability to have a bit more time for your stakeholder engagement build up, for the initial engagement with all of the groups in your project design, that's where that organizational element really comes in. If you only have 2 weeks to do all of your consultations and then start your project, it's going to be super difficult to do this. So it's one of those sort of institutional things that is helpful to try and put in place. And I also just want to reflect on the comment there about the about conservation organizations being part of the local conflict, because we see it play out in both directions. In some cases, the conservation organization is very well placed to bring people together because everyone has a shared interest in that particular resource or an iconic animal or a forest that everybody loves, and then it can work really well. But if there is already a conflictual situation and the conservation organization is seen as pushing a particular agenda, then it's much more complicated. So the key is really to also just think about how people are seeing you when you're doing that stakeholder engagement, and what does that mean in terms of where you sit on the map.
Thanks, Hesta. I was going to ask many more questions, but we are running out of time. We have just 3 minutes more. So we'll have to pause on the questions for now and probably follow up via email if we didn't get to some questions. But before we wrap up, I just wanted to ask if each panelist can go ahead and say one thing that you want people to take out of the conversation as they leave today. So maybe Hesta, I would start with you, and then we go to Nalucha and then Alec.
Okay, great. Thanks, Onyi. I think my key message, I guess, is that in all of the work that we're doing with conservation organizations, even though people say we don't know what you're talking about when you say conflict-sensitive conservation, the moment we ask and the moment we start the conversation, all this stuff comes out. In other words, everybody's already working on it, but you may just not be calling it conflict sensitivity. And by applying something like this approach, it just helps to put a frame on it and a vocabulary on it so that you can be a bit more intentional about how to do this work in a conflict sensitive way and how to bring the organization along with that whole process. I'll leave it there.
From my end, what I've experienced is that it is important to build relationships with local communities as you work on using approaches such as sensitive conflicts to conservation. And we have seen how powerful it is, more especially in the Kasa region, where we have been able to address issues around natural resources such as water, which has been very critical in the areas in the years where we had very less rainfall and very drier periods. And we saw wildlife being able to encroach human settlements and the trying to push back the conflicts that were brought about, and everybody would be calling you, WWF, come and get your elephants. We don't want your elephants. And then yet the critical resource which was at the center of it was water. So being able to provide water points for animals, but also water points for humans, and being able to build that coexistence was very powerful to see and to continue to see, especially when communities themselves are invested and they're using their indigenous knowledge as well as nature-based solutions in terms of the solutions that they've always applied to some of these in bringing about interventions that deal with human-wildlife conflicts, such as desilting the lagoons, building check dams to be able to slow down the little rainfall that they were able to receive, and being able to bring back, even for the first time, being able to see some crocs swimming back into some of their communities. And so that really has been powerful. Thank you.
Right.
Thanks, Nalucha. I think we're at time, so I'll go very, very quickly. I think that we're faced with these two existential crises of biodiversity loss and climate change, and protected areas are such a critical tool in our toolbox globally to address both of these crises. At the local level, at the global level, these are crucially important ecosystems. But the work that we as conservationists and those who support conservationists are doing has to be done in a conflict-sensitive way to ensure its sustainability, to ensure that it has in mind both the benefit to local communities as well as to the plants and animals that reside within these critical landscapes. So I would encourage everyone to sign up for the course that we shared the link for. It's self-directed, it's self-paced, it's very informative. And thank you again for joining us today for the webinar.
Thanks everyone for joining us. We'll definitely share the resources in a follow-up email, and then we'll put up the presentation just in case you want to refer back to it. Thank you, and do have an amazing day, and thanks to the panelists for giving us some of your time to talk through this. Bye everyone.
Thank you very much. Bye everyone.